Greetings and salutations. It is I, Mr. Nothing, the museum curator of the weird and the strange and the host who might be Spider-Man. Welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels throughout Marvel's New York City. So today I wanted to talk about a comic book that I read in a different direction. I will not be focusing on a DC comic this time, or one of DC's imprints, Vertigo. I will be talking about one that focuses on Spider-Men, and the death of a loved one. Today I am talking about the comic collection, Death of the Stacys, which combines the Amazing Spider-Man 88 through 92 and 121 through 122 to show the death of both Captain Stacy and his daughter later on due to the careless action of Spider-Man, as J. Jonah Jameson would say. So this is by Stan Lee, Romita Sr., George Conway, and Gil Kane. Stan Lee was a big name in comics, and I know he had his name on the comics at the time, and he didn't always contribute 100%, which angered the other writers that he worked with. But he still had a lasting influence on design and story choices. So he does deserve some credit there. I haven't heard of the rest of the people, but I presume since they worked on these comics that they have some power to their name, and I hope I find them when I read more Spider-Man comics in the future. What to say about the Death of the Stacys? Some people have argued that it is a seminal comic, both in the Spider-Man mythology, but also in terms of the larger comic book industry as a whole. Whether or not that is true is up for some debate, and I will talk about that later in the video. But I've heard of this before. A lot of people have talked about it, so I've always known that Gwen Stacy dies, especially because, there's so much focus on Mary Jane Watson later on. You're like, oh, what happened to that Gwen Stacy? Oh, she died. And I'd say I prefer Mary Jane Watson over Gwen Stacy, but Gwen Stacy is pretty good as Spider-Gwen in her own superhero way, so that's fun. But without further ado, let's talk about this comic. I will do some summary, some analysis, and we will move on from there. So, Death of the Stacys begins with the comic Arms of Doc Ock. Doc Ock has escaped from prison, and he makes his way to an airplane on a runway that has Chinese diplomatic leaders on it, and he holds them hostage. But luckily, Spider-Man saves the day, but Doc Ock manages to fly the plane out of the airport. He's not a good pilot at all, so the plane explodes, and he's believed to be dead. But in the next issue, Doc Ock lives. The authorities report that no body has been found, so Spider-Man suspects that Doc Ock may still be alive and kicking and ready to cause some havoc out there. And wouldn't you know it, he does run into Doc Ock later, and there is a big fight where Doc Ock gains the advantage, and the comic ends on a cliffhanger where it looks like Spider-Man is in mortal peril. This comic is followed by And Death Shall Come. Spider-Man loses big in the fight, and he's injured, so he changes out of his costume and runs away before Doc Ock can find him. And he collapses on the ground, but luckily he is found by Captain Stacy, who is Gwen's father. He takes him back to the house and treats Peter, but he discovers that Peter is healing faster than normal, which suggests that he might not be all that he seems. But Captain Stacy does not tell anybody about this. Luckily, Peter, before their fight ended, Peter managed to put a tracer on one of Doc Ock's arms. So after he's done healing up, he goes and finds Doc Ock, but it's a surprise, and it's a trap. Oh no. Doc Ock is waiting for him, and they have a big fight on a roof, and Doc Ock damages part of the roof and it falls off, and it's going to fall on a small child, but Captain Stacy shows up and pushes the child out of the way, and the rubble falls on top of him. And unfortunately, that kills Captain Stacy. And before he dies, he tells Peter to look out for Gwen, indicating that he knew that Peter was Spider-Man, and to protect her now that he's not going to be around to do it. And the next comic, To Smash the Spider, the public largely blames Spider-Man for the death of Captain Stacy, even though it was mostly Doc Ock's fault, Doctor Octopus, if I haven't said the full name there. The public includes Gwen Stacy, as she sees Spider-Man as a menace and somewhat responsible for her father's death. A criminal named Sam Bullitt decides to take advantage of this hysteria and announces his candidacy for the New York City District Attorney. He runs on a platform of law and order, which is funny given that he's a criminal, and he says that he will bring down villains like Spider-Man if he is elected. And Gwen Stacy even volunteers for his campaign, because she's feeling a lot of rage towards Spider-Man at the moment. After a long night of crime fighting, Peter returns back to his house in a Spider-Man costume and is surprised to find Sam Bullitt and Gwen Stacy there, which is, a bit odd, because what is Spider-Man doing at Peter Parker's house? Questions. In the next issue, when Iceman attacks, Spider-Man decides to, in order to prevent them from making the connection, Spider-Man kidnaps Gwen and uses it as a ruse to try to tell her that she shouldn't be hanging around Sam Bullitt because he is a criminal. And she's trying to ruin Peter Parker's good name by having a criminal in his apartment. And so while he's talking to Gwen, Iceman sees this and sees it as it's a kidnapping. So he attacks Spider-Man and there's a big fight, but luckily Iceman isn't able to take down Spider-Man. Meanwhile, because the Daily Bugle is writing unkind things about Bullitt, Sam Bullitt, he ends up going to the Bugle and kidnapping Robbie Robertson, one of the writers. Peter finds out, so he and Iceman take down Bullitt's goons, and then they go expose Sam Bullitt for the criminal that he is, ruining his campaign. And so that's the end of that specific arc right there around Captain Stacy. The next issue takes place 2 years later, Turning Point. Harry Osborn is ill at this point. He's had a bad interaction with LSD, the boogeyman of the 60s and 70s. So Peter goes to check on him, and Norman Osborn flips out because he views Peter as somewhat responsible for what's happening to Harry, even though he doesn't have any proof of it. Norman knows that Peter is Spider-Man because he is also the Green Goblin. But he has amnesia at that point, so Norman can't attack him or anything because he hasn't remembered that. But the combined trauma of seeing his son ill and seeing Peter again reawakens the Green Goblin persona, and so he decides to enact vengeance upon Peter Parker. And he does this by kidnapping Gwen Stacy and taking her to the George Washington Bridge and calling out Spider-Man. Spider-Man shows up, and in the ensuing fight, Gwen Stacy falls off the bridge. When Spider-Man goes to save her, the unfortunate thing happens, and that is that Gwen Stacy's neck snaps, and she dies, and Peter is deeply saddened by this and mourns her death while Green Goblin watches. And in the last issue, Green Goblin's Last Stand, Green Goblin is mocking Peter and they fight, but Green Goblin escapes while he's still mourning Gwen Stacy. So eventually, Peter manages to catch up with the Green Goblin, and they have a fight where Peter is very brutal. He's actively trying to hurt the Goblin, but he stops himself just short of killing the Goblin because he doesn't want to end up just like him. And so the Goblin takes this as a mercy and takes advantage of it, and he tries to impale Spider-Man on his glider, but Peter jumps out of the way and it impales the Green Goblin instead, thus killing Norman Osborn. Will he return? Probably. And then finally, Peter is isolated and alone, kind of turning away his friends in his grief, and MJ shows up, and Peter tells her to leave, but she refuses. She wants to be there for him in his sadness, and so you can see MJ and Peter growing close together at this point in time. And so that's where the Death of the Stacy arcs ends. It's later continued in the Clone Saga for a short while. In terms of analysis, there's a little bit to talk about here. One is that I love how colorful this comic is. I love its design. It's quite different from the Batman and Sandman comics that I've been reading, as it's very vibrant. And I really like Spider-Man's classic blue and red costume design. I'm not such a big fan of Peter Parker's design, as he looks like a 45-year-old man, even though he's supposed to be like a 20-something college student. So like, that's not my favorite design, and I'm much happier that they eventually redesigned him in later years. But I do like the colorful nature of this comic, and it definitely helps it set it apart from other things that I've been reading, and probably what else existed at the time. So that's a point for it. Way to go for the artist in this case. But let's get to the big question at hand here. In the intro to this specific comment, Stanley and the other writers note that this comic arc is very important because it marked an evolution of Spider-Man's character in the Spider-Man comics, as well as it forced an evolution in comics, not just with Marvel, but in DC and in other areas. For Spider-Man, it made comics more emotional. Things now had more stakes, and Spider-Man had to react to villains differently, as he knew they could easily take out someone he loved now. So that happened for Spider-Man, and then they argue that this happened for other Marvel comics, and eventually DC adapted as well. And to some extent, I would agree with that. I will say that the Clone Saga and the Civil War Saga and this Symbiote Venom Carnage sagas, all of those built off the death of Gwen Stacy by introducing stakes and being unpredictable, because any villain could just kill off somebody that Peter loved, and Peter had to behave differently. He couldn't be the goofy quipper that he used to be. He still is, but he had to take things seriously every now and then. And then that extended to other comics like the X-Men, Iron Man, and Thor, etc., etc. And eventually DC Comics, which I will agree, like it's you can't understate the influence of the Gwen Stacy arc in comic books at the time. However, is this the only comic book to do that? I would say maybe at times this is overstated too. Like, it's important, but a lot of people say it's more important than it actually is. Because at the same time, DC was doing the Crisis on Infinite Earth storyline, where they were just nuking their multiverse at the time. And I do recall that Supergirl died in that arc, and there's a very famous picture, I might put it around here somewhere, where Superman is holding Supergirl in his arms as she's dead. And it kind of has similar vibes there. So maybe it's less that Spider-Man influenced this change in comic books, and more that the writers of the time realized that times were changing and they needed to adapt, and so that the general trend was moving toward this more emotional direction. So this is an important artifact from that era in that time, in that direction, but maybe it's not 100% responsible for this change, or even as grand as people say it is. But it is still important for the Spider-Man comics, because without this, maybe you wouldn't have the more serious Spider-Man arcs in the future. But there's another question of, does Gwen Stacy need to die for this change to happen? I would argue maybe not. It's hard to say for sure because this is a prime example of fridging female characters. As I made a video about the refrigerator monologues, and one of the stories was this, like a female character is killed in service of advancing the character arc of a male superhero or any other superhero at the time, and so women are deemed sort of less than and expendable in superhero comics. And I will say, to some extent, that's true here, but mainly it's kind of not, because Gwen Stacy's death is a fixed point in the Marvel universe, much like Uncle Ben's death, and they're not bringing Uncle Ben back to retcon anything, because if you would, then that undermine the underlying message that with great power comes great responsibility. And with Gwen Stacy's death, the lesson seems to be don't be arrogant and make sure you hone your powers in a way that you know that you can save someone when you need to. Because Spider-Man is kind of responsible here because of his inexperience and his arrogance, because he just thought, oh, just shoot a web and I can save Gwen Stacy, and that wasn't enough. Like, he needed to do more to save Gwen Stacy, and that's the lesson that he learned here. So I think that what was my point is that maybe Gwen Stacy's death serves a purpose here and isn't just, an example of killing off a female character. But a big problem with this is that another person died in this arc, and that's the Green Goblin. And he has been, brought back to life countless times over the years. And Gwen Stacy has been brought back to life none. And I'd say they're both on the same level. Like, Gwen Stacy was Spider-Man's love interest, and Green Goblin was Spider-Man's love interest, or a major villain in his life. So why does one person get to be brought back, but the other person doesn't? Beyond the whole clone saga, I'd say that's a glaring example of the difference between how comic book writers view male and female characters. It's kind of ridiculous. So on the one hand, I can definitely see how this is. It was necessary to kill off Gwen Stacy, but on the other hand, it does seem like a bit of a necessary way to write her off, when you could have done any number of other things to have the same emotional impact, and get Spider-Man to the point where he could do the clone saga and symbiote stuff later on down the road. Overall, despite those issues that I've noted, I did like the death of the Stacys collection, and The Night When Stacy Died is a very good comic. It shows Spider-Man feeling rage and grief and pushing people away, but there's also that hopeful point near the end where Mary Jane shows up, and there might be some more love in his life in the future. Of course, she's just there to be used as cannon fodder as well, to be killed or to be kidnapped at the mercy of New York City's many supervillains. But I enjoyed it, and I guess I recommend it to you out there. It seems like a fun collection to read, and it's an important artifact from history, so worth checking out. If you read this before, or you want to simply comment on something that I've said here, feel free to do that. I would love to talk to you about this collection, and recommend any other Spider-Man comics that you think I should check out in the future. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that we can get Spider-Man comics out to the masses and people can find out about some fun arcs in the life and times of Spider-Man. And in the meantime, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and web-slinging travels. Farewell.